Mr. Mansell.
My lady, the next witness is Ben Osborne, please. He could be sworn.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Take a seat.
Could you give the inquiry your full name, please?
My name is Benjamin John Osborne.
Mr. Osborne, thank you very much for coming along today to assist the inquiry. You have also kindly provided a witness statement for this module of the inquiry. It is INQ 485977, and this is your witness statement provided on behalf of Pfizer Limited. Is that right?
That is correct.
That statement is signed by you. Are the contents of it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are indeed.
Thank you. You explain in the statement that Pfizer is a US headquartered multinational pharmaceutical and biotechnology company which develops and produces medicines and vaccines in a wide range of therapeutic areas.
Indeed.
Its UK affiliate, Pfizer Limited, was incorporated in 1953 and has sites across England.
That's correct.
Since December 2023, you have held the position of President, International Commercial Office at Pfizer.
That's correct.
You were previously Managing Director and UK Country Manager of Pfizer Limited from December 2018 to January 2022.
Yes.
From January 2022 to September 2022, you held the position of Regional President, Hospital Business Unit, International Developed Markets.
I did.
And during your time as UK Country Manager, the role which is most relevant, I think, for your evidence today, your responsibilities included leading Pfizer's UK Biopharmaceuticals organisation, overseeing key business and operational matters relating to Pfizer's medicines and vaccines in the UK.
That's right.
The first topic I'd like to deal with you with, please, is the development of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, brand name Comirnaty. So the vaccine was created, is this right, in partnership with the German company BioNTech?
That is correct.
And Pfizer had been working with BioNTech since 2018, seeking to develop an influenza vaccine based on messenger ribonucleic acid, or mRNA, technology.
That's right.
We've heard a bit about mRNA technology during the course of this module of the inquiry. It's sometimes called a novel vaccine. It was the first time it was authorized as a vaccine technology. Is that right, in relation to the Covid19 Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine?
It was indeed, although the research and the science into mRNA vaccines had actually been ongoing for some 2 decades, widely across the world, but in particular through our BioNTech partner.
In your statement, you set out vaccine development timelines and include a useful diagram, which I believe was originally utilised by Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam in November 2020. We can see that, please, in your statement at page 16. Perhaps you could zoom in on that. Thank you very much. And you set out here the traditional vaccine development timeline and the accelerated timeline below it. Just looking at the traditional vaccine development timeline, we can see that phases 1, 2, and 3 occur consecutively.
That's right.
The regulatory review aspect of the process occurs at the end of the clinical trial process. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then once authorised, there is then the move to large-scale production and distribution.
Indeed.
But overall, this is a process that, as the arrow shows us at the bottom of that first diagram, it takes several years.
Absolutely.
The accelerated timeline, this is the timeline that was used in relation to the Covid-19 vaccines, including the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. we see there the clinical trial phases, phase 1, phase 2 and 3 overlapping. Is that right?
That's right.
There's rolling regulatory review throughout that process, yes?
Yes. Not through. So the way to think about it, in the traditional R&D model, one would run a phase 1 or multiple phase 1 studies. Potentially there's a period of time where there's then a break, phase 2, break, assessment, and then into phase 3. Potentially then a break as manufacturing decisions are made, certain investments, etc. I think what you see in the document here and in this diagram is actually how there was much more parallel processing here. So from a trial perspective, actually we rolled straight from phase 1 into phase 2 and into the pivotal phase 3 study, which provided the evidence that we submitted to the regulator. And once we had that data, that's what the MHRA and other regulators around the world assessed our vaccine on.
Is it right that there are perhaps two aspects to the rolling review? You've got the aspect you were just speaking about, which
Yes.
which deals with authorization.
Indeed.
And the information that needs to be submitted to the regulator in terms of authorization. But also during the trial process
Yes.
and getting authorization for trials, that is also something that can happen on a rolling basis and did happen on a rolling basis during the pandemic.
So indeed, the regulator is involved right from the very start. In fact, before any patient is vaccinated, before phase 1, there is discussions with regulators, with the MHRA and others around the world. And they are then assessing our data, our protocols, our manufacturing steps at all stages of the development of this vaccine. In terms of the rolling review to the MHRA, that began in October. And as you're aware, the actual pivotal phase 3 study, the actual results of that came out, I think it was early November. So they had already started to assess some elements of the vaccine before the major phase 3 study read out.
We can also see a difference here in the stage at which the manufacturing process begins, because at-risk manufacturing is taking place during the phase 3 trial process.
That is right. Typically, we would wait till we had the confirmation of essentially a medicine that we believed would then be approved by regulators around the world. We knew in this situation that if we waited to those timelines, we wouldn't necessarily be able to serve the global needs and the volume of vaccine that would be required. So we invested over $1 billion in 2020 at risk, our own financial risk, because we didn't take any investment from any government around the world to essentially start that manufacturing scale up.
The process has gone from the traditional timeline taking several years to 10 months plus. With that accelerated development timeline, did that come at the expense of safety assessments?
No. Safety is absolutely at the forefront of all of our decision making as Pfizer.
That can come down from the screen, thank you. You explained that 2 clinical trials formed the basis for the initial authorization of the vaccine, Study 1 and Study 2. Study 2 included those pivotal phase 3 clinical trials. We've heard evidence about this already, but there were almost 44,000 enrolled study subjects.
That's right.
And the trial was conducted by Pfizer in the United States, Germany, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina, and Brazil.
Correct.
Were the same clinical trial processes followed in relation to that trial as would be followed in respect of a trial taking place in a non-pandemic setting?
Yes, absolutely. The standards, the requirements under good clinical practice, GCP, were exactly the same as for any other pivotal phase 3 study that will be conducted.
You mentioned GCPs. Are those the international ethical and scientific quality standards that are applied?
They are the standards essentially applied to our industry and academics running such studies, yes.
Is it right that no suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions or SUSARs were reported during
That is
those
correct.
trials? Now, an issue that the inquiry has been looking at is the ethnic diversity of clinical trials. You may have seen the evidence of Professor Prieto Alhambra yesterday, and indeed in his report. He explains that the Pfizer phase 3 trials had 83% of the participants were white, 9% black, 4% Asian, and 2% multiracial. Now, were those trials sufficiently diverse?
Yes, they were.
And can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, so as we began the development of this vaccine, diversity was absolutely critical to us, and indeed we knew to the population that were going to be ultimately using this vaccine. They needed to have confidence in the vaccine. We sought to ensure that our study was run across multiple sites, across a diverse population, so that the data that ultimately we submitted to the regulator for independent assessment was reflective of the population that would ultimately be vaccinated around the world.
We've seen other figures that explain that the trial had 42% of global participants and 30% of US participants with a racially and ethnically diverse background. How can we make sense of the two figures side by side?
Yeah, sure. So the 42% is essentially reflective of a Black, Asian, Latino population. So that's how we essentially square that one.
So taking into account the sites in Argentina and Brazil and the...
Indeed, the Latino population were also, in terms of the overall summary, included in the 82.9% that were classified as white. So it's essentially a sub-racial group within the 82.9%.
From an industry perspective, do you have any recommendations as to what can be done in the UK to ensure greater ethnic diversity in clinical trials?
I think it goes beyond actually racial diversity here. I think it's really encouraging and helping society at large to understand the importance of clinical trials and the role that every member of our society, no matter which group one would essentially fall into, to really understand the value of being part of a clinical trial. And what is involved as part of that. So I think it goes back to education and really government and others and the NHS really investing time, effort and energy in education around the value of clinical trials, and then making sure that essentially when clinical trials are being run, that we are reaching all aspects, all members of society with the opportunity to partake in a clinical trial.
Is this right, that pregnant women and immunocompromised individuals were excluded from the clinical trials?
That is correct. And certainly when it comes to clinical trials, certainly the pre-authorization phase, it is standard procedure in the vast majority of trial cases that pregnant women are not involved at that stage.
But Pfizer conducted post-authorization studies, including among pregnant women, but there were challenges with that, you explain in your statement, because by that point, vaccination had been recommended among pregnant women, so there was not the cohort there to draw upon for the phase 4 clinical trials. Is that a fair summary?
Indeed. So as part of our agreed pharmacovigilance follow-up, so one of the PASS study post-authorization safety studies was in pregnant women. And we essentially found that across the world, many pregnant women had already started to be vaccinated, given local national immunization guidelines. And so recruitment became a real challenge in this situation. And ultimately, the trial was stopped because we weren't able to sufficiently recruit enough women into this study.
That raises the obvious question, is there a case for including such groups like pregnant women in pre-authorization studies so that you can get the randomized control trial data that otherwise you may not be able to obtain?
I think that's a matter for the regulator to decide whether a population such as pregnant women and children should be included in such studies.
What about the immunocompromised? Did that post-authorization trial complete successfully?
Well, immunocompromised patients weren't involved because the very nature of their immunocompromised state means that they typically would not respond to a vaccine. So they required other treatments, as we've heard over the last few days through the inquiry.
Let's turn now to authorization and pharmacovigilance, please. You explained that following assessment by the MHRA, the vaccine was authorized under Regulation 174 of the Human Medicines Regulations on the 2nd of December 2020. The inquiry is by now very familiar with Regulation 174 authorization. It is not the same as a market authorization.
No, it's not.
And you observe that the legislative provisions setting out requirements for post-authorization of monitoring of medicines and vaccines are normally directed at the marketing authorization holder, which would be the company, yes, Pfizer and BioNTech in this example. Because this was authorization under Regulation 174, was there less stringent conditions imposed upon Pfizer as a result of that in terms of pharmacovigilance? No, they were not less stringent. I would say they were incredibly rigorous. I think everyone recognized the scrutiny that would be given to these vaccines. They were very robust and they went beyond what we would typically see, I would say, in many cases in terms of the frequency of review. So not the standards, but the frequency of data review, given the volume of patients that were being vaccinated in the UK and across the world. We can perhaps look at some of those pharmacovigilance monitoring obligations now, please, just to run through them. Is it right that Pfizer was required to submit an update when appropriate, a risk management plan? That is right. Is it right that Pfizer was required to maintain a global safety database containing adverse events for its vaccine? That is correct. And also provide periodic safety update reports to the MHRA? Yes. Could you just explain what those are, please, and what the reporting requirements were? So essentially, these, as you've described, we collect data on a global basis. And at specific time points, we were required, mandated under this temporary authorization to provide these safety update reviews directly to the MHRA and other regulators across the world, so that then, in the case of the MHRA, they could then take this data set that we had collated and then assess that alongside those potential adverse events that have been reported through the yellow card scheme. Those periodic safety update reports are normally provided every 6 months? I believe so, yes. But the timescales applied were more exacting in relation to the Covid-19 vaccine, I think. They were indeed. They were much more frequent, yes. They were provided monthly for 11 months. That's right. And then the report. And then I think we went to every other month after that. So it was a sustained period of increased frequency of submission. You've mentioned post-authorization safety studies. There was a commitment on the part of Pfizer to conduct 10 post-authorization safety studies. Is that right? Yes. Now, you may have seen Professor Prieto Alhambra's report. He recommends that there should be greater obligations on pharmaceutical companies to conduct early post-authorization safety studies with a particular focus on the risk-benefit of vaccines among groups underrepresented in or excluded from phase 3 trials, so perhaps groups like pregnant women we've already spoken about, but he also places an emphasis on ethnic minorities, not excluded from trials but perhaps underrepresented, elderly people with frailty or multiple comorbidities, and people with disabilities.
Yes.
A greater obligation on pharmaceutical companies in that regard. What is your view of how workable such a recommendation is?
I mean, it's an obligation we take very, very seriously. I think in the first instance, we seek to make our clinical trial program, and certainly our phase 3 program, reflective of the population in which we ultimately intend to serve. Our intention then is to very quickly, but in a regulated way, in line with decisions directly from the MHRA and other regulators, to move through the appropriate subsequent studies in a phase 4 setting. So the past studies to which you're referring to are agreed directly with the regulators. It is not Pfizer sat here saying we wish to study in X, Y, and Z population. It is a direct agreement with the regulator.
There's a commitment made to conduct a certain pass as part of authorization being granted.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yes.
And will that be decided on a case-by-case basis, in a vaccine-by-vaccine or drug-by-drug basis, how many pass need to be conducted?
Yes, it will.
And which groups will need to be focused upon?
Yes, it will.
What about reporting timescales? Are there requirements in relation to that when a pass has to report to the public?
I'm not aware of the details specifically on the reporting timescales. My belief is that it would be in line with when essentially sufficient data has accrued that a decision can be, or data can be then submitted to the regulator.
I think it's right to say that 2 of the 10 past studies that Pfizer committed to have been published to date, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And the others are pending in various stages.
Ongoing assessment, indeed.
Pharmacovigilance monitoring, we've spoken about the obligations on the company, on Pfizer in this particular case, in relation to pharmacovigilance monitoring. As safety signals are assessed, as they come to light, is this right that it can lead to an update of the product information?
It can indeed.
That product information is approved by the MHRA.
That's right.
And it is this right, a central way in which the public and healthcare professionals are updated about the safety profile of a drug, in this case a vaccine?
That is correct, and I think the example of anaphylaxis actually in the very first few days of vaccination in the UK is a really good demonstration of this process actually doing exactly what it should have done. So on the 8th of December, there were a number of rare cases of anaphylaxis associated with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. They were discussed with the MHRA and assessed by the MHRA and their independent experts on the 9th of December. And on the 10th of December, the SPC and the patient information leaflet and subsequent guidance to the NHS vaccination centres was changed.
Yes,
so rapidly that potential safety signal was translated back into clinical practice.
And people would be familiar with the 15-minute observation period that was introduced as a result. You've spoken about anaphylaxis. Let's look at myo and pericarditis,
yes,
please. And I'm going to ask you about the updates to the product information regarding those conditions. But first of all, is it right that myocarditis and pericarditis are conditions which, as well as having an association with mRNA vaccines, can also be caused by Covid-19 itself?
Indeed, and I think the data as we stand today demonstrate that the frequency is actually higher in an unvaccinated population who have had COVID-19, and indeed the myocarditis and pericarditis is typically more severe than that seen in relation to that induced by a vaccine.
The first reports of myocarditis and pericarditis emerged from safety surveillance in Israel.
That's correct.
And at that stage, no signal had been validated based on the data available to Pfizer-BioNTech, and no other regulator had raised similar concerns.
That's right.
Pfizer worked to determine the relevant background rates for myocarditis and pericarditis and performed an observed versus expected analysis. Could you just explain to us what that is, please?
Yes. So if we just look at the chronology here, so a number of rare cases were identified on the 28th of December, as you say, in Israel. Actually, it was in April that Pfizer-BioNTech met with the MHRA to begin the conversations on myocarditis, or specifically, to have conversations on myocarditis. We continued then to assess our data as the MHRA did. What we then saw in May was the Center for Disease Control in the US. Their data demonstrated a similar potential signal to that seen in Israel. At this point in time, we were asked directly by the MHRA for further data, which included an assessment of what was the baseline prevalence of myocarditis in the general population and specific populations, so younger men, because what they were looking to do was to identify, was this a vaccine-driven event or not? And so by understanding what the baseline incidence was, one could compare the incidence rate seen in real life.
So in terms of from the point that the safety signal emerged, was there close contact and communication with the MHRA about the work you had been doing and the signals you was receiving in relation to this condition?
So there was constant dialogue, as there is for all of our safety assessments with the MHRA and other regulators. And when essentially we presented the data back to the MHRA on the 22nd of June, a decision was then made on the 25th, and rapidly that translated into an updated SPC and patient information leaflet.
You've mentioned the 25th of June 2021. That is the date on which at that point I think referred to as the Regulation 174 product information was updated. We can see that, please, the Reg 174 information for healthcare professionals. It's INQ 507930. There it is. And page 5, please. We have section 4.4 at the bottom of that page, and that's special. Special warnings and precautions for use, and then we can move on to the next page, please, page 6. There's the anaphylaxis you mentioned earlier, but at the top of this page, myocarditis and pericarditis. There have been very rare reports of myocarditis and pericarditis occurring after vaccination with that's the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, often in younger men and shortly after the second dose, typically mild, and individuals tend to recover within a short time following standard treatment and rest. And then what healthcare professionals should be alive to.
That's right.
In relation to that. That can come down, please, because of course that is the product information, the Regulation 174 information for healthcare professionals, but we can see the information for recipients at INQ 507943. Page 3, please. Possible side effects, section 4. And we can see side effects may occur with the following frequencies, and under not known, towards the bottom of the page, cannot be estimated from the available data, and including inflammation of the heart, myocarditis, or pericarditis. So that is what patients are being told as of the 25th of June 2021 in the information provided. And then things further develop, that can come down, thank you. And we move to the 14th of March 2022, when further analysis has been done. You've been liaising with the regulator on on an ongoing basis?
Yes.
And at this stage, because I think by this point the vaccine had market authorization, it's what we know as the patient information leaflet,
Yes.
or PIL. And we can see that, please, INQ 507969, page 3. So this is from the 14th of March 2022. Possible side effects, and very rare side effects may affect up to 1 in 10,000 people. Inflammation of the heart muscle, myocarditis, or inflammation of the lining outside the heart, pericarditis, and the symptoms there. And that can come down, thank you. So as more information had come to light and been analysed, there was greater clarity about the frequency of this association.
That is exactly right. And that's the nature of how the pharmacovigilance process works, that over time and as essentially these events are accrued and understood, then the confidence of the event rate is then able to translate into the data and the numbers that we see then in the SPC and PIL.
The inquiry's expert, Professor Evans, has suggested that a new approach is needed to patient information leaflets. We were just looking at one there. His view is that they need to be updated, perhaps changed, made available much more online, and split into categories to make them perhaps easier to digest for recipients. What you need to know about the risks before you're given a medicine, what you need to know about risks while you're taking the medicine, and what you need to know in the event that an adverse event has occurred that might be a result of taking the medicine. Now, from the perspective of the manufacturer, what is your view of whether those are sensible suggestions for reform?
I think in terms of the characterisation of pre, during, post, it is very sensible. I think from my perspective and that of industries, I think the most important thing is that these are tested with patients. These patient information leaflets are regulatory documents. They are decided by the MHRA under a particular template and format. This is not the discretion of Pfizer or another company. And I think this is perhaps a situation where actually there's a great opportunity to involve patients here. What works for patients? There's a huge range of, obviously, knowledge across patients in terms of their scientific understanding of the medicines which they're taking, and it needs to work for everybody. And so I think this is an opportunity to test with patients. I don't think it's for me to sit here and say what this should look like.
Next topic is the yellow card. We've heard a lot about that during the course of the Module 4 evidence. We're familiar with what it is. But in your statement, you note that during the pandemic, quick access to safety reports was more important than ever. However, the time lag between the data being shared via the yellow card platform and being passed on to Pfizer meant that Pfizer did not have immediate awareness of that portion of adverse events which were available to the MHRA. So just to sketch in some of the background here, Pfizer receives information about an adverse event. You have to tell the regulator.
That's right.
The regulator, the MHRA, receives information about an adverse event through the yellow card platform.
Yes.
It shares that information with you
Yes.
at Pfizer so that it can inform your picture
Yep.
of the safety profile of the vaccine. Is that a fair summary?
That is a very fair summary, yes.
And yet you talk about time lags here. What sort of period are we looking at, and what were the consequences, if any, of that delay?
So I'm not aware of any consequences as a result of that delay. I mean, in effect, unless a patient or a HCP were to report in tandem to both the MHRA and to Pfizer, there will, in effect, be a delay because the event is being submitted. It needs to be processed, assessed through the MHRA before it's reported to Pfizer. I don't know the specific details on how long that delay would be, but it wasn't consequential to any patient or safety assessment because all of those reports were being continuously monitored by the MHRA. If any signals were identified, they were immediately raised with Pfizer.
nevertheless, you suggest that the system could be made more efficient.
Indeed.
With an investment in technology and a strong encouragement for electronic rather than paper submission
Yes.
of yellow card reports. I just want to deal with a couple of other recommendations with you, if I may. The first is in relation to clinical trials, because in your statement you make the point that the UK is falling behind other comparable countries when it comes to clinical trials, commercial clinical trials being conducted in the UK. You point out that we're 10th in the world for industry phase 3 trials, falling from 4th in 2017 and far behind countries such as Spain is the example that you give. What can be done to make the UK a more attractive place to conduct those commercial phase 3 trials?
Yeah, I think the Lord O'Shaughnessy report actually captures very, very clearly the approach, the strategy that the UK should take. I can't do that justice this afternoon, but I think there are several things. I think there's a recognition of the association between the investment that companies will make in R&D in a particular country and the utilization of that. So what I mean by that is making sure that we have a whole system-wide approach to the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, and making sure that there's a seamless transition between research and actually those medicines, those vaccines, then benefiting the population in which they've been trialled. As I think I note in my evidence, there is often too long a delay between the research in the UK and actually then the routine use in clinical practice for patients. Reducing that gap down so it is a seamless flow would significantly improve things.
The final point I want to raise with you, Mr. Osborne, is one of the recommendations made in a document called Breakthrough Nation 2. This is INQ 507914, please. And this is a suggested agenda that Pfizer has put together for prevention, innovation, and investment in life sciences in the UK. And we can see, thank you, that number one, in terms of the recommendations in that document, is about the mission-led approach of the vaccine task force, which in Pfizer's view, should be applied to address other major healthcare challenges that can come down. Thank you very much. How was the VTF's approach different in terms of industry from where you sat in industry? You describe it as a single front door for industry.
That's right. It was a very significant shift for us in terms of our relationship and working with government. It provided single points of accountability. It provided a very rapid and agile decision-making approach. It ensured that when there were issues, when there were challenges that needed to be navigated, there was rapid access to the right expertise to essentially resolve those in a very collaborative partnership way. So yeah, I think when you then look at some of the big societal health challenges that we face, cancer, Alzheimer's, and other such diseases, that there are some significant learnings that we can take from the approach of both the Vaccines Task Force and Antivirals Task Force as well.
And in terms of facing a next pandemic, it's an approach you'd like to see replicated?
Very much so. And I think in particular, and we've heard this from other witnesses, the importance of that expertise that was around and involved in the Vaccines Task Force was absolutely central to the approach.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. My lady, those are all my questions. I believe Mr. Weatherby, KC, has a question.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mansell. Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you very much. Mr. Osborne, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK group. Just one point from me, and it rather picks up from the last point that you were speaking about, I think. In your witness statement, and for the record, it's paragraph 38, under the heading of Pfizer's understanding of the preparedness of the UK for the rapid development of a disease X vaccine in early 2020. You state, and I quote, "The focus on an influenza pandemic, together with an assumption that a pandemic-specific influenza vaccine based on existing influenza vaccines could be made available within 4 to 6 months after the start of a pandemic, meant that there had been limited coordinated investment in development of vaccines against new viruses," unquote. Does it follow from that your view is that the UK government had not done enough to facilitate research and development of vaccines to address disease X prior to 2020?
I think as we've seen from across both here in the UK and across the world, we weren't ready for COVID-19. Overall, from a very specific Pfizer perspective, it didn't impact the development of our vaccine or delay at all. We didn't take any government money from the UK or indeed across the board.
Okay. With respect, that rather avoids my question. The statement that you put in your witness statement is that the focus on influenza vaccines meant that there'd been limited coordinated investment in this area. Do you agree that that was, in fact, the case, and that the UK government should have been in a better position?
I think there have been less focus both in the UK and further afield in this space, and I think it's one of the key learnings now as we move forward. That we need to make sure we're not just putting our eggs in one basket. We need to look broadly across the range of technologies, the range of expertise, companies, academics that will ultimately contribute to solutions for future pandemics.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Osborne. Those are all the questions that we have for you. Thank you for your help in providing the statement and answering our questions, and thank you for your help coming along today.
Thank you.
Very grateful to you. Mr. Keith.
My lady, the next witness is Dr. Justin Green, please. Yes, please, if Dr. Green could be sworn.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
you have to take a seat.
Sorry if we kept you waiting, Dr. Green.
Could you please commence your evidence by giving us your full name?
Justin Anton Green.
Dr. Green, thank you very much for attending today and for providing the witness statement which you have dated the 7th of November 2024. You are, is this right, a UK qualified infectious diseases and general internal medicine physician. You obtained an MA from Cambridge, BA in medicine and surgery from Oxford. You're a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. You have a diploma from the School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene and from the College of Physicians of London, a PhD from Imperial, and notably and most importantly for our purposes, in November 2020, you were one of the 3 global clinical project leads for the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine.
Correct.
I want to ask you, please, about some events that occurred in Singapore in 2002 to 3. Were you at that time working in a hospital as a registrar?
Yes, I was a clinical registrar on the wards in a 1,000-bed hospital, which is a big hospital in Singapore.
And what did you have to deal with during your time there?
So general infectious diseases, but for well over 3 months, I was one of the clinical registrars looking after hundreds of patients with SARS-CoV-1 in the first coronavirus outbreak in 2002-2003, where I looked after hundreds of patients with this condition, including some of my colleagues who got infected in the hospital, 2 of whom died.
So you've seen firsthand the impact, well, you saw then the impact of a pandemic.
It was an epidemic, but yes,
epidemic,
yes.
Yes.
But certainly this disease, this disease.
The evidence before this inquiry demonstrates that the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, which was rolled out in great numbers from January 21, and in particular during those first 3 months of 2021, saved thousands of lives in the United Kingdom. You're aware, I'm sure, of a mathematical modelling study which estimates that vaccinations generally have prevented over 14 million deaths from COVID in 185 countries, and also of estimates to the effect that in the United Kingdom, by September 2021, the COVID vaccines had prevented more than 23 million infections and 123,000 deaths. In your statement, you identify a number of very general reasons or explanations why the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine was able to be produced, manufactured, and subsequently rolled out. And I just want to ask you about those reasons. Had there been, in the years leading up to the pandemic, considerable research done on the technology, the vaccine platform, chimpanzee adenoviral Oxford platform, from which the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine was derived?
Yes, Dame Sarah Gilbert's team and other teams in Oxford had worked on this platform in a number of conditions, and pertinent to this was another coronavirus called MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which is very similar, and therefore that gave them confidence that they had phase 1 data that looked at safety of this in small number of healthy volunteers, but also that they might have a product that could give a suitable immune response against that condition, and therefore increased our confidence that might be the case in SARS-CoV-2.
And had the technology also been worked on for the purposes of trying to develop vaccines for influenza and other pathogenic diseases such as Zika,
malaria, HIV, others? They'd done a number of phase 1 studies. So actually we had quite a lot of phase 1 data, albeit in different diseases with the same vector, that gave us confidence that there should be a high chance of success in phase 1 at least.
How important, secondly, to the development of the vaccine was the degree of funding for research and development, in particular from the UK government and the bodies such as the NIHR and UKRI and others, and the recruitment or the ability to recruit into clinical trials?
So obviously this is Professor Pollard's team, so I speak with that in mind in terms of it was a collaboration between us and Oxford. But I think he's made it clear that the availability of funds, particularly for what they call the COV1, which is the phase 1 study that they did with 1,000 patients, and then rapidly moving into the COV2 study, was incredibly important. That was made available early, with reassurance from the other phase 1s that it was a worthwhile investment to make, albeit at a higher risk than you might make at other times not in a pandemic setting.
And to what extent did your team find that there was a heightened degree of a greater level of recruitment in the course of planning and conducting the trials for the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, and to what extent did that level of recruitment make a difference?
So those recruited very fast. I mean, I think it's fair to say vaccine studies often, even outside of the pandemic setting, but these studies do recruit fast because you've got ambulatory healthy individuals volunteering for studies. But certainly in the context of the operational team at Oxford, they were really pleased and obviously were able to recruit those very rapidly, those trials.
Thirdly, you refer in your statement to what has been very clearly established by the evidence in the course of this inquiry so far, to the effect that the MHRA permitted data in relation to trials to be submitted on a rolling basis rather than waiting to the end of the clinical trial process to receive all the data together. And similarly, in relation to the application for authorization, was prepared to consider the data, the paperwork, on a rolling review basis. Did that help with taking an overall view on the efficacy and the speed of the process with getting to the point of authorization?
I mean, undoubtedly it did. We did a data lock in early November. We provided the final clinical documents. I think the headline results were on the 23rd of November. And then obviously the approval was in late December, and that really is very accelerated, and that was clearly related to our ability to submit on a rolling basis, not just clinical information from preclinical studies which had already been completed and therefore were ready to be submitted, and manufacturing.
Was safety in any way compromised or reduced by virtue of that ability afforded to you by the MHRA to provide data on a rolling basis?
No.
Finally, on this topic, you pay tribute in your statement to the prioritization by all the stakeholders, to use your phrase, involved in this process. So everybody in Oxford, at AstraZeneca, and on the part of the state, and in particular the regulatory authority, the MHRA, worked extremely hard and very fast to make sure that the process was completed within as short a time as could reasonably be permitted. I mean, bluntly, did this mean that, by contrast to what had gone before, phone calls were made every time of day and night, emails were sent immediately, meetings were scheduled and held repeatedly and with great frequency, the system was made to run very, very hot?
I mean, I think it was very clear that the reason we were able to go so rapidly was because almost the entire machinery of AstraZeneca was turned over in order to support these trials for this and our monoclonal antibody Evusheld as well. And also the same was happening in Oxford and at the MHRA and other agencies. And there were, everybody was ready to respond rapidly, but with the same level of quality in that very busy time.
The effectiveness of the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine has been trawled over and reported upon, and countless reports published on its effectiveness. But in addition to that issue, was the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine a vaccine which was produced and manufactured and made available without profit?
Yes.
And was that something which Oxford-AstraZeneca was prepared to agree, not just with the United Kingdom government, but with other governments around the world?
Absolutely.
And another hugely important aspect of that vaccine was, by contrast to one particular other vaccine, was it a vaccine which was more readily transported, stored, and physically delivered?
Certainly early in the pandemic, we knew that we had a vaccine which could be stored at 2 to 8 degrees, and therefore, from a global perspective, from a logistical perspective, was going to be incredibly advantageous for
people that had similar supply chains set up in non-pandemic settings in order to ensure that large volumes of this product could be supplied globally, as well as obviously within the UK, in the sense of going to harder to reach regions.
Turning now to the subject of clinical trials, please, Dr. Green. Are clinical trials an ordinary part of all medicines development and manufacture?
Yes, not just vaccines, obviously. Small molecules, monoclonals, other therapies.
Could you say something, please, in general terms about the degree of scrutiny directed towards the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, but by comparison to historic vaccines, perhaps by comparison to the COVID vaccines? Was it a vaccine which has been subject to unprecedented degrees of scrutiny?
By whom? I think everybody was scrutinising it. So I think, we had high level of scrutiny, obviously in the public domain, in the press, but also obviously from not just regulatory agency in the UK, the MHRA, but in parallel we had submissions in Europe. So we were dealing with getting a European approval, which we got in late January. We had interactions with WHO. We had, certainly in early 2021, we were dealing with the Brazilian government and other independent regulators that were asking their questions of our data. Not all of those questions were the same, and therefore we were answering all of those during that early part of 2021. I think just to put that into some kind of context, we answered 1,500 clinical questions, and I think at AstraZeneca, of all the products that we've got, that's 3 times more than any other product we've ever had.
In general terms, were the clinical trials led by Oxford as opposed to AstraZeneca, or was it a shared endeavour?
So the University of Oxford sponsored the trials. Professor Pollard's team did a heroic effort of managing those trials, and then we partnered with them in terms of then using the data that they had collected in order to support the file that we made and the authorization that we got. But we then became what's called the market authorization holder, and therefore responsible after authorization for that product.
So you made the authorization applications, you helped with the analysis of the data and its interpretation, and no doubt you provided software and a great deal of the number crunching as well in support of your applications for authorization.
We did, although the original analysis was actually done by Oxford and repeated by us, and that was very important for Oxford as well as ourselves, and that's not usual, that actually we came to the same conclusion on the same data sets.
So expand on that. The data having been made available from the output from the clinical trials, it was looked at by both AstraZeneca and Oxford.
Yes.
Independently of each other in order to reach a view as to the significance of the data.
Well, to come to exactly the same numbers so that we were completely confident that the way that it had been analysed was actually giving exactly the same numbers in terms of efficacy, but also obviously safety and immunogenicity.
All right. There were a number of Oxford-AstraZeneca trials, or Oxford trials perhaps, COV1, 2, 3 and 5. They're the ones I'm most concerned about. Some of the trials took place abroad, and in particular, COV2 trial and COV1 trial took place in the United Kingdom. Is that right?
That's correct.
And just please help us with a general overview of the scope and the scale of these trials. The COV1 trial in the United Kingdom, roughly how many trial centres did that involve?
I think it was 5.
And roughly how many participants?
They final analysis was 1,077 patients.
COV2 was in the United Kingdom. It was the phase 2, phase 3 trial. Was that over 10,000 participants?
About 12,000, yeah.
12,000. COV3 was in Brazil, over 10,000.
In about 7 sites.
And COV5 in South Africa, how many participants?
About 2,000, and in some of those were HIV positive as well, which was important.
Were all the trials randomised and controlled?
They were all randomised and controlled, yes.
Most were single-blinded. We now know what single-blinded means, and
Yes.
one, I think, was
COP5
double-blinded.
was double-blind.
And were the trials carried out, even though some of them had taken place abroad, in accordance with the MHRA's good clinical practice for clinical trials?
Yes, I mean, the way that they were conducted was certainly done to international standards, of which the MHRA's is a very good example of that, but yes.
And is that because the MHRA standards or assurances are agreed at international level and at least consistent with what other international regulators
Yes,
demand?
the International Council of Harmonisation, or ICH, would say that within that the MHRA standards fulfil what we consider that GCP, good clinical practice, is.
Staying with the issue of diversity of trials, could you please look at the article in the Lancet 000153551? This was an article dated the 8th of December 2020. And Dr. Green, did Oxford-AstraZeneca put its data from 4 of its ongoing blinded randomized controlled trials and the analysis into the public domain through Lancet?
That's right. That was published, I think, on the online and is open access as well. So you don't have to pay to or be part of a library in order to access that. And that we felt was very important, that any publications were done swiftly, that they were done in high-impact journals with, high standards of peer review, and therefore we were pleased that Lancet agreed to publish that paper. And
is it self-evident that the degree of detail is at a very high level? The numbers, the data, the percentages, it's all there.
Well, there's a high level of detail here, and we were pleased that Lancet gave us a little bit more space to get more information in than their usual articles. But actually what lies behind this is hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents that I helped edit and write with my colleagues that formed the basis of the readout of the clinical trial that was then submitted to the MHRA. This is a summary, and this is a précis of that summary.
All right. But we can see from the findings that information is given there not just about overall vaccine efficacy, but also about the fact that in relation to, was it one of the trials or all the trials, there were 10 cases hospitalised for COVID, all in the control arm. And 2 were classified as severe COVID-19, including 1 death, so in the control arm. Was that across all the trials or one of the trials?
No, this is a pooled analysis, and so that was across all of the trials, although the, and so that gave us a really good indication that we had an excellent product here that was going to be really effective.
And so we're absolutely clear, during the course of the trials, amongst the cohort of participants who did not receive the vaccine, because they were in the control arm, some were hospitalised, 2 got severe COVID, and 1 died.
And unfortunately, 1 died, yes.
Had you not known with absolute certainty that that poor individual who died had not received a vaccine, and they had died without that knowledge, you wouldn't have known whether or not they died from the vaccine or from COVID?
Well, you'd know that information after you'd unblinded the trial. So
quite so.
You may, during the course of a trial, occasionally understand who, particularly in the context of serious safety issues, you might unblind an individual, but you would only know that at the end of the trial. So you would know that you'd had 10 severe cases and you'd had 1 death, but until you unblinded the trial in late November 2020, you wouldn't know whether that person had had vaccine or not.
But the general point is that, of course, people could and did die from COVID itself.
Yes.
There's a reference there to person months of safety follow-up, 74,341 person months. What is that?
I mean, it's large.
Well, what does it mean?
And extensive, and what it means is that, of the if you total together the number of participants and how much each individual contributed to the safety database, because this was an interim data readout. You know, one individual could have contributed 1 month and one individual could have contributed 11 months, but overall there was a cumulative amount of safety in 74,000 person months. The median time that individuals had been followed up at the time of the submission of our original file was about 2 months. So we knew that we had that very early. And importantly, in a vaccine study, we had information where we consider the most likely time that these adverse events will present that are likely to be related to vaccine.
And then turning to severe adverse events, there are a number of severe adverse events amongst out of the total number of participants, 168 people.
Yes, you'd expect that in 23,000 individuals, but what's more important is the attributable ones, so the ones that either the investigators prior to unblinding or even after unblinding you felt were related to the vaccine, and the number of those were very, very low.
There were 84 events amongst the group of people who had received the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine, but there were 91 severe adverse events amongst the control group who had had no vaccine at all.
Yes, and the imbalance is mainly driven by the fact that unfortunately they got very severe COVID, and that's likely to lead to a serious adverse event because they would have been hospitalised.
And that's because many of these severe adverse events appear in the community coincidentally.
Yes, I mean, if you break your
amongst us
leg
all.
and you end up in a hospital, it may not be because of the vaccine, but you'd still have had a serious adverse event.
Of those severe adverse events occurring in the vaccine participant group, of the total number of severe events, 3 events were classified as possibly related to a vaccine, 1 in the vaccine group, 1 in the control group, and 1 in a participant who remains masked to group allocation. So did Oxford-AstraZeneca carry out inquiries in each case of severe adverse events and try to determine what link, if any, there was to the vaccine as opposed to the severe adverse event occurring coincidentally?
Yes, usually prior to unblinding you have that information, and then subsequent to unblinding you look at those individuals that have had vaccine. And actually the one in the vaccine group, because actually of those 3, only one of them ended up being in the vaccine, was somebody that had a very high fever and sought medical advice for that fever, and therefore reached the qualification to be a serious adverse event. But that was self-limiting, and actually we now know that individuals having fever with this vaccine in the first 7 days of delivery is not uncommon.
Could we just look at some other aspects of this report? Page 3, there's a reference to the COV2 trial. So that's one of the 2 trials that was in the United Kingdom. We can see it in the bottom left-hand corner. It says, enrolment particularly targeted individuals working in professions with high possible exposure to SARS-CoV-2, such as health and social care settings. So as part of that trial, you were focusing on particularly people in the health and social care sector.
That's correct.
Page 4, there's a reference to the COV3 trial in Brazil and the COV5 trial in South Africa. May we presume that because they were trials in Brazil and South Africa, there was a more diverse racial and ethnic makeup amongst the participants?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the ethnicity of individuals in Brazil is often very mixed because of the historical migration patterns, and then obviously in South Africa we had a high proportion of black individuals.
But because the UK trials tended to be, I think, larger, or at least one of the UK trials was quite large, in terms of overall ethnicity of the trials, you've got to pull all the participants in all the trials and see what the overall figures are. And so that's why elsewhere in this report, the overall figure is about 76% participants were white, 10% black, 4% mixed ethnicity, 3% Asian, and 7% other. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. we've learnt a great deal about pharmacovigilance, and I needn't ask you about the general system. It is clear that Oxford-AstraZeneca appointed, for the purposes of the clinical trial process and seeking authorization, a data safety monitoring board. Amongst the papers before the inquiry, it's clear that the trial was paused in September 2020 to investigate a serious, unexpected, suspected adverse reaction, a SUSAR, a case of transverse myelitis, in fact, and the issue arose as to whether or not it was associated with the receipt of the vaccine. Was the pausing of the trial something that would have been ordered by the Data Safety Monitoring Board embedded within AstraZeneca or Oxford-AstraZeneca?
Excuse me. No, that would be done by the study team. So usually you would consider there's a number of people that might pause a trial. So the pause might come from the investigator. So you would say we're going to stop and we're going to find out about this case, and then we're going to discuss that with what's called the DSMB, which is the Data Safety Monitoring Board. It could be done by the Data Safety Monitoring Board, and sometimes it's done by the regulator.
All right. So there are different degrees and levels of, I suppose, safety supervision.
Yes.
And do you recall how it was the position was reached that the trials could be recommenced?
Yes, there was discussion, obviously, between the sponsor, which was Oxford, and the clinical team, which was Professor Pollard's team, with our input to the DSMB. And the DSMB agreed that they felt that there was insufficient evidence of causality from the vaccine. And therefore, that was then, what you do is you then agree with the regulator that your position is that vaccination should restart. And obviously, in the context of new safety findings, you would be very much looking for those conditions and obviously all the other conditions you're expecting to find. And therefore, it would have been agreed with the MHRA. And in actual fact, because we had other international clinical trials ongoing at the time, it was also agreed with other international regulatory agencies that we would restart our trial, and that they agreed with that.
The safety monitoring, safety supervisory system obliges a manufacturer pre-authorization to provide preclinical studies, clinical trial data. It would seem almost any data or information related to safety and the issue of whether or not a prospective authorization might be impacted by that event. But did AstraZeneca and Oxford also receive and make available reports from members of the public who'd taken part in the trials?
So I don't think I fully understand your question.
Well, we know from the pharmacovigilance system that there's a process by which members of the public and clinicians can report through the yellow card system.
So you're talking about post authorization?
That's post.
Okay.
But was there a system in place whereby either pre or post authorization, anybody who'd taken part in a Oxford-AstraZeneca trial could get in touch with Oxford-AstraZeneca directly and report suspected side effects?
Yes.
To you directly.
So the usual conduct, and the conduct in this case with the clinical operations team at Oxford who ran the trials was that that Professor Pollard had a number of staff working for him, some of which were physicians, and that all of those participants would have been informed at the beginning of the trial how they could contact the trial site on a 24-hour basis, 7 days a week, if they had any symptoms that they were concerned about. And that's encouraged. You know, that is part and parcel of the covenant of working with people who volunteer to be in your trials, is that you really give them easy access to trial staff so that they can report those, even if they're late. So sometimes, we might even find out something after someone's finished a trial, and if they report that, that would then be subsequently included in the database.
And are these reports from those participants analysed by the company, put through your data systems, followed up in certain circumstances, as well as being reported to the regulator, the EMA or the MHRA, whoever it is?
They are, and in fact, we put in a number of reports in terms of the clinical study report that was submitted. So we put the rolling submission in late 2020, but in the second quarter of 2021, we submitted formal clinical study reports of the early part of the trials. And then later, we submitted final study reports, which reported on the totality of the safety and efficacy data of all of those individuals in those 4 trials, followed up to completion of those studies.
Did trials continue after the date of authorization?
Yes, so for many months afterwards. So we were looking at, in those 4 trials, we were looking at everybody being followed up for a year, and a large number of those individuals were actually rolled into another study to look at the second year of safety in a study called Covid19, which is subsequently finished.
And was there a large trial, I think, with sites in the US, Peru, and Chile, which carried on throughout 2021 following authorization, an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, double-blind?
Yes, we
reported subsequently.
Yes, we also started a trial in the late summer of 2020, which was using sites in the 3 countries that you've quoted, and that reported in late March 2021, and very reassuringly, in a second complete data set, so a second phase 3 study, we demonstrated very similar efficacy, almost identical efficacy against severe disease. And what was most reassuring for us at the time was very similar safety profile, although I might add we did not see any cases of transverse myelitis in that data set.
Another important part of the safety monitoring process is the provision of a risk management plan. Can we just have a look at this? At INQ 000506071, we will see the risk management plan, which was submitted on behalf of the Oxford-AstraZeneca adenoviral vaccine, AZD12222, to the EMA. And is this a document which is in its first instance drawn up by the company?
Yes, you draw it up prior to authorization or approval, and often in the late stages as you get towards an authorization, you would negotiate to update this and obviously then mutually agree what the contents of this are, because it's critically important for post-approval, post-authorization planning and delivery of particularly safety information, but also effectiveness.
So you set out what you propose to do if authorization is given and how precisely you're going to continue to monitor safety and report on it. And we can see the data lock point for this document is the 4th of November 2020, so pre-authorization.
That's right, and you identify which safety issues you either already know about and which ones you continue to have concerns about, despite the fact that you may not have seen them in a clinical trial, because there are some generic understandings of doing vaccine trials whereby you always are concerned about particular adverse events that have been associated with many other vaccines, not necessarily within the COVID space.
Because, for example, in relation to some vaccines, perhaps the Covid-19 vaccines, there is always the possibility of a thromboembolic event. And that's one of the AESIs that are identified in.
That's right, but let's be clear that thromboembolic event would be something that we would expect to see in clinical practice, like a deep vein thrombosis or a pulmonary embolus, and not something associated with low platelets, different pathophysiology.
And if we can just quickly go through pages 3, we can see here the index and the sorts of issues which are covered by the risk management plan, prevention of COVID, the non-clinical part of the safety specification, information about the trial process, who were not studied in the clinical trials, post-authorization experience, identified and potential risks, and over the page. The pharmacovigilance plan setting out all the things that will be done going forward for the purposes of maintaining this high level of safety.
That's right, and you can see there lower down, page 47 and below, that also requires you to complete, report out and report back to the regulators the trials that you've done. So that kind of it's not just about new activities, it's about ensuring that you've completed the activities that you're undertaking at the time of authorisation.
And just to pick up some of the pieces of evidence which the inquiries explored in the course of the hearing, if we look at page 33, we will see, by way of example, what is known as missing information, so the absence of pregnant and breastfeeding women in the course of the AstraZeneca trials, as well as those with severe immunodeficiency. So you're reporting on all aspects of safety for the purposes of the trials. Page 36. Details of the obligations to examine the data sources for signal detection, safety signal detection. Page 39, detailed information concerning the ICSRs, the case safety studies, signal evaluation, and I could go on.
Well, under authorisation 174, I think what was made abundantly clear to us, and it's clear in this document, is that actually the commitment for pharmacovigilance was no different to what you would get in a routine conditional marketing approval. So the pharmacovigilance part of the RMP was definitely as expected for any other product in or outside of a pandemic.
We've not enjoyed acronyms generally. By RMP, you mean the
risk management plan. This risk management plan.
All right. And then if we look at the MHRA risk management plan, INQ 000506077, I think I have engaged in an acronym there, the Medicines and Health Products Regulatory Agency, we can see there the country-specific addendum to that risk management plan precisely for the purposes of the agency and the United Kingdom.
That's right.
Post-authorization, there were a number of obligations imposed on you, whether or not to provide summary safety reports, periodic safety update reports, provide scientific and medical reports which have been published in the literature, data from your database, anything to do with adverse events, as well as specific post-authorization safety studies. Is that a fair summary?
That's right, but in the context of this actually it was heightened. I mean, there were twice weekly phone calls, which is unusual. There were monthly reports, which again is unusual and was increased for what would be expected for a normal product. But that was a reflection of the fact that we knew that this was an important product that was going to be used in many millions of people very quickly.
How many post-authorization safety studies, do you recall, were done?
I think there are 9 listed.
And were they all given to the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency?
They have all been completed. Only one is not reported, which is unsurprising because it's a pregnancy study, but all of the others have been completed. The clinical study reports have been completed. They are available in the public domain, many in almost unredacted forms, and a number of those have also been published in peer-reviewed journals.
All right. Fees. Does a manufacturer wishing to seek authorization for the use in a particular country or in the United Kingdom of a medicinal product, including a vaccine, have to pay a fee.
Yes.
And you also pay fees, I think, a subscription fee for particular portals overseen or run by the regulator.
Yes.
Is there any financial link between AstraZeneca and the MHRA?
None whatsoever.
The authorization was granted on the 29th or the 30th of December 2020, and were there a number of conditions attached to the authorization by the regulatory agency?
Yes.
And did those conditions concern not just use of the vaccine, but also the continuing obligations of pharmacovigilance?
Yes, they did.
If we can look, please, at 000413711 at page 3 to 4, we'll see at the bottom of the page, paragraph 23, AstraZeneca must operate a comprehensive pharmacovigilance system for this product. It must submit to MHRA inspections to assess compliance. There must be full product life cycle compliance with the risk management plan, promptly and regularly liaise to ensure safety specifications, submit protocols, and so on. So it's a condition of the authorization that this stringent process continues.
That's correct.
All right. Another important part of it is the system by which the company produces product information about the vaccine. Is that right?
Yes.
And must all the product information which you provide about your product be approved by the regulatory agency?
Yes.
Because this was a process under Regulation 174 of the medicines regulations, did you produce for healthcare professionals and then for UK recipients something known as Regulation 174 information?
Yes, that's right.
We'll look at the healthcare professional one first, 413715. If we go to page 2, you can see there the name of the product, the quantitative and quantitative composition, pharmaceutical form, clinical particulars, and does it set out a great deal of detail about the nature of the product, the risks, the benefits, the contraindications, and so on.
It does.
And then the information for the patient, UK recipient, 413716. Page 2, what the vaccine is, what you need to know, how it's given, possible side effects, how to store, and contents of the pack and other information.
It is, but this document particularly, we were at pains to try our very best to make sure that it was written in a language and a style that was understandable to everybody that might receive the product.
The information you provided subsequently found its way into what we know to be the patient information leaflet and also the summary of product characteristics. Is that information updated as you go along?
Yes, you update it as and when you have information that you feel is important for people to understand the product that they might receive.
And by and large, are those changes agreed with the regulator?
Always.
Does the regulator have an ability to say, you may not want that information in, or you've got a good argument why that information doesn't need to be put in, or it's not relevant, but we, the regulator, want it in anyway?
I think what you're describing is actually quite common in pharmaceutical medicine, which is an imposition.
It's a technical, or it's a term of art.
That's the technical description of what you're saying, which is that we would have an opinion about a particular adverse event or a particular set of wording within the either the patient information leaflet or the summary of product characteristics. But ultimately, the regulator would insist on that language, and we would come to usually a mutual conclusion about the best language for that, and that would then go into that label and would be disseminated.
In your statement, you very helpfully included a table listing all the changes that were made in the product information by reference to all adverse drug reactions, whether demonstrated to be linked to the vaccine, or merely associated with the vaccine, or just suspected to be associated, or maybe not connected at all, but an adverse event about which public concern has been expressed in relation to whether it is connected to the vaccine. And just by way of example, if you could have page 34 of your statement, INQ 474537, have you provided a summary of how the product information was changed in relation to thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, TTS, called by some VITT? It's very rare. Is that what the data showed?
Yes.
The summary of product characteristics, SMPC, was changed on the 7th of April 2021,
Yes.
following that bank holiday weekend, in fact. And a description was added to section 4.8, referring to very rare events of major venous and arterial thrombosis with concurrent thrombocytopenia, noting a causal relationship has not been established. That note was then removed on the 15th of April, and I think that was the final change made, was it, to the summary of product
Regarding that
characteristics?
particular adverse drug reaction.
TTS. All right, so that gives us a good idea. And that the same approach was applied in relation to any other adverse event suspected, confirmed, or just argued to be connected to vaccines in this list.
That's right. So when we read out our US trial, for example, we had a bit more information about the early reactogenicity reactions, and we made adjustments with that information. So you're data driven, and once you have that information, you update it. So you've got the best summary in that document, and obviously the patient-facing version of that document, so that people fully understand what it is that is associated with this product.
Finally, you've helpfully provided in your statement you've identified a number of lessons learnt and made a number of recommendations, and I just want to very briefly run through those. In relation to clinical trials, you refer to the possibility of encouraging the government to ensure that there be trial hubs which can be pandemic ready to support institutions with recruitment and the efficient operation of trials. What did you mean by trial hubs?
Well, I think what we found in the UK in COVID was that Professor Pollard, has a lot of colleagues who very rapidly were able to mobilise clinical trial sites that either already existed or they created subsequently new clinical trial sites, trained up investigators that would be appropriate to look after participants of the vaccine. And it's really understanding that you need a sustainable system of clinical trial sites that can pivot towards a pandemic setting, but also more likely in that context expand so that you would have the capacity, because you're not only doing clinical trials of one vaccine, there were several vaccines that might want to be trialled at any one time, so you've got the best opportunity of getting one that's safe and efficacious, but also monoclonal antibodies, because monoclonal antibodies like Evusheld are critical in the context of having an armory of products that could be used, because not everyone will respond to a vaccine, and also therapeutics for individuals that are ill with the disease and might actually have less severe disease once ill with small molecules. And all of that will require thought, will require planning, and it needs to be sustainable so that you're not suddenly doing it today, having not had that capacity yesterday.
You've spoken about the rolling review of clinical trial data and of the data supporting the application for authorization. Was that process adopted by the regulatory agency to deal with the exigencies of this particular crisis something you would recommend for future use?
That was incredibly important.
And finally, is there anything that you would ask the inquiry to consider to be done in relation to access to medical health records, electronic record electronic data records, and essentially information from the NHS concerning the possibility of adverse events.
So post-authorization, post-approval, the availability of real-world evidence is incredibly important. It was incredibly powerful for us because data coming in February from Scotland, from Public Health Scotland, was incredibly important in confirming how well our vaccine was working. But what we found was that we had to set up our own real-world evidence studies as well as the ones that were being done. And more importantly is the triangulation of information that already exists. So the triangulation of primary care data, where people may well first present with disease, may have a diagnosis made, with laboratory data, which is often in a different electronic system, with hospital data. And it's that if you're going to do really effective post-approval real-world evidence studies, having those three systems that can actually triangulate and be drawn into one source of information that can then be analysed would be incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful.
You referred to a study. Is this the position that on the 19th of February, the first set of real-world effectiveness data for the vaccine was published by Public Health Scotland and a number of Scottish universities? But it was the only one published at that time. What you're calling for is that there be a better regulated and managed system for the provision of that sort of real-world post-authorization data.
But wouldn't it have been amazing if that also had really deep and rich safety data? And we could have had that at the same time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Green. But thank you to you and your colleagues for all that you did to develop the vaccine. Obviously, there are millions of people around the world who are very grateful to you and your team. And thank you very much for all that you and your colleagues have done to help the inquiry, producing the statement and coming along today to help us. Thank you very much. I hope you haven't denuded AstraZeneca. You seem to have a number of colleagues with you. Thank you very much indeed. 10:30 on Monday the 27th. Thank you.
All rise.